Hi, it's Chris Wolf back again for TOCA Backstage, and I am honored to have James Garner from the upcoming show on November 3rd at 8 p.m. at the Armstrong Theater. James, what is the actual title of the show?
Sure. James Garner's tribute to Johnny Cash. And it's our Folsom at 50 tour that we're celebrating this year, being the 50-year anniversary of Johnny Cash's performance at Folsom Prison, January 13th, 1968.
Awesome. And so as a musician and a performer, how did you gravitate to Johnny Cash?
Sure, great question. I discovered Johnny Cash when I was 11 years old. And I fell in love with the music. I didn't know who he was at the time. This would have been in the early 90s, and Johnny Cash's best radio days were behind him. You didn't hear him much on the radio at the time, but he came to play in my hometown, which is in the Central Valley in California, Hanford, California. And my dad went to the show, and I didn't know who Johnny Cash was, so I was kind of curious, who my dad was going to see. And I remember we ended up, I bought a tape one day, Johnny Cash tape, and I wanted to hear it. And I listened to it, and I'm like, wow, where has this been all my life? Because just the music was obviously something that was different than what you heard on the radio at the time. I was listening to songs that were recorded in the 50s, and this was 25 years later. And it was just something about the music, not only the production of the music, not only the voice, but also what was in the music, the stories, the songs, they meant something, and that just resonated with me. And certainly I grew up on a cotton farm in Hanford, and Johnny Cash grew up on a cotton farm. Granted, his life was a heck of a lot harder than ours was. But the themes, the agrarian themes, the rural themes that he sang about, I knew what he was singing about. And I think that, looking back, I don't think I was conscious of any of that at the time, but looking back with perspective, I think that was a big part of it. And it just spoke to me.
That's amazing, because typically you hear about performers who do tribute bands or tribute shows, and there really isn't that much of a connection, but it sounds like you have a lot deeper connection to Johnny Cash than most. What came first, the love for Johnny Cash or the ability to perform?
Oh, certainly the love for Johnny Cash. This show is the only thing I've ever done musically, and it will be the only thing I do. I fell in love with Johnny Cash, when I was a kid. I didn't sing at the time. I didn't play the guitar at the time. Johnny Cash inspired me to do all of that. I picked up the guitar. I started to learn his songs on the guitar, listening to these tapes that I bought. And it was years later before, I ever did anything professionally in music. And this was the first thing I ever did because this is what I wanted to do. There's really no interest in doing something else. This is what I love. And Cash's music is what I love.
That's great, because a lot of performers that I find that's true, that they grab onto their passion and they just sort of follow it. Mm-hmm. How long have you been performing this particular show?
This is our 11th year now, and when we started, we were I was just a kid who loved Johnny Cash music and wanted to go play it in front of people and tell the stories about Johnny Cash, because that's a big part of our show. It's not only just the music, but it's some history about Johnny Cash. And it's, looking back now, 11 years, it's like, wow, we've been a lot of places. We've played at some wonderful places. And every show is special, because we're playing for people that are really there for Johnny Cash. They either grew up with the music or they discovered it too. I look out in the audience today, and I'm even surprised by the amount of young people that are out there in the audience these days, because they're going through the same thing that I went through, at 11, 12, 13, and discovering Cash's music and wanting to hear it performed live. And unfortunately, you can't hear Johnny Cash do it live anymore. I was fortunate enough to see him and see him in concert once. So it's just a real blessing to be able to do that.
What is it what do you think it is about his music that sort of resonates with the younger people? Because I've noticed that as well, that
Mm.
um, it is music that you don't hear on the radio anymore, or it really kind of is like almost storytelling music or songs, and but yet it does attract. It speaks to like a larger audience. What is it about his music you think that does that?
I think that there's an honesty, or there's truth in his music. I think it's straightforward. And there's a message. Maybe that's the best way to say it. I mean, in his songs, I mean, some songs are, kind of fun, just I say throwaway songs, but they're just cute little songs. But if you listen to a lot of his music, there is some message in that music, and I think that and it depends what it is. I mean, he recorded an entire album of songs about Native Americans, and released it in the '60s, and it was a real kind of social justice type album. Calling attention to the plight of the Native Americans. Prison reform. There's a lot of songs that he's certainly associated with prison, and he only ever, for the record, only went to prison to sing songs. He was never in prison, but he had something to say, and there was a message there. And I think that people are looking for something that they can, that just seems like honesty to them. And I think you find that in Johnny Cash music. And young people are finding that, and of course the people that grew up with it, they know all about Cash's history. They know him from the television show. They know what he stood for. They read his biographies. I think that's what's different. And I think that's why Cash's music stands the test of time. I mean, he's been gone for 15 years now, and still people are gravitating to his music. He will be around for a long, long time.
Yeah, he certainly is iconic. I mean, his music really is iconic, and the Folsom album. He you say he only went to prison to perform. Was that? Do you know the story behind his going to Folsom? What inspired him to do that, and how that became, or how that came about?
Sure. Well, he started doing prison concerts very early in his career, like year 1 or year 2. He played in Huntsville, Texas. That was his first prison concert. And, he wrote some of these songs about prison. I don't know, prison life is the right thing, but incarceration. And, he said, he wrote in his autobiography that the first time he played a prison, it was really electric. It was the prisoners responded to the music. They were glad that someone from the outside world was there to come and see them. They knew that, he wasn't getting paid to do that. He just came to do it and say, hey, there's those of us out here. We know that you're here for a reason. You've broke the laws and you were sentenced to go to prison, but we're not forgetting about you. That was kind of his message. And so he did a lot of prison concerts leading up to the infamous 1968 concert. He even went to Folsom in 1966, 2 years before the recording. And how things got hooked up at Folsom. Cash was living in Southern California at the time, in Ventura, which he lived there for, probably 10 years, from 57, 58 to about 67, 68. And knew a pastor down there, Floyd Gressett, who did some ministry up at Folsom Prison at the chapel. And that's how they got introduced. Of course, Cash had the song Folsom Prison Blues, which was a hit back in the 50s. And Floyd Gressett brought him in and to do a concert. And that's how that started. The 68 concert was a real big comeback for Johnny Cash. He had commercially kind of fallen off the charts. His last big hit was years prior to that, probably 4 or 5 years. And he had been pressing Columbia Records, which was his label at the time, to do a prison concert. He said, if we're ever going to record a live concert, there's no better place to do it than prison. It's going to be amazing. And the record executives were very skittish on it. They said, no, we can't take the risk and go to prison. We don't know how the general public will respond to this. We're just too buttoned up to do something like that. And after a lot of pushing and talking and negotiation, and kind of a interesting sidebar to that was the influence of Bob Johnston, who was Bob Dylan's producer at Columbia, had come over to produce Cash, and Bob Johnston was a big force and said, yeah, I'll do that. You know, he was a bit of a rebel and a risk taker and didn't really play by the rules at Columbia. I said, oh yeah, we'll do that. We'll go make that happen. So they did. They schlepped in there with a bunch of recording equipment. And it was a big comeback for Cash personally. We talk about this in the show. 67 was a real low point for Johnny Cash. He wrote about it in his biographies and the struggles that he had personally, and had really turned around his life around in 1968 or the late 67. And coming out here to California, doing the show at Folsom was a big comeback for him. Commercially, it was big for country music. When that album dropped in the summer of 68, I mean, Johnny Cash was ubiquitous. He was, he was Taylor Swift. I don't know who Lady Gaga, whoever today is big. That was Johnny Cash. He was everywhere. You couldn't get away from him,
And so how his career had a weird arc, like you were talking about, because he started from like nothing and then grew to popularity, and then he kind of dwindled down and kind of went away and then came back. So Folsom was the big comeback time?
It was one of the comebacks. It's interesting to look back at Cash's career because, as you said, there were a lot of arcs. There were a lot of ups and downs. He hits the scene in 1955 at Sun Records. Elvis is there, Carl Perkins and the rest, Jerry Lee Lewis. And it's a big splash. Cash is big. He goes off to record at Columbia, and he generates a lot of hits through about 1963, Ring of Fire, 1963. And then, he's touring around, but commercially, he's still releasing music, but the number one hits aren't as frequent, and even the top 10, I mean, there's a few top 10 hits along the way. And 68, Folsom Prison was the big comeback. It was huge. And that launched probably a period of 4 or 5 years where Johnny Cash was truly an international superstar. Because after Folsom came San Quentin, he kind of repeated what he'd done the year before, and took a show to San Quentin, recorded it. A Boy Named Sue was on that album. Then came a network television show, and he joked, I won't get the phrase exactly right, but he said something about, going to prison twice, doing 2 prison concerts finally made him reputable enough to be on network television, And so he has a TV show on ABC. This is at a time where there's 3 channels in the country, the big 3, and he's on it every week. And you talk about Cash being big. I mean, he was larger than life. And of course, on that show, he brought a lot of other musicians from outside of country music. Dylan was on his first show, James Taylor, Stevie Wonder, the Monkees, Mama Cass. I mean, he just brought a lot of different talent into people's living rooms there over 3 years. And that continued for a couple of years. He was playing huge arenas, Madison Square Garden, the Oakland Coliseum. It was big. And then, in the 70s, things started to wane a little bit. And certainly, and then into the 80s, then he's dropped by his label. Columbia says, thanks, but no thanks. We're moving on to, the new hot young acts. Thanks for everything you did for us. I'm not even sure they said thanks. And then there's this, and there's a period where Cash is wandering out there in the desert commercially. He's still touring around. He was a road warrior. He loved to be on the road. He loved to do concerts. So he was still playing. I mean, he played Wembley in the 80s. So he was still playing large places, but you didn't hear much on the radio. And then 1994 comes. He hooks up with Rick Rubin, American Recordings. Of course, Rick Rubin had produced the Beastie Boys and Red Hot Chili Peppers and worked with Tom Petty. And now Cash has there's a rediscovery of Johnny Cash, by a much younger generation. I was in high school at the time. And I remember telling all my friends, I'm like, see, I told you this guy was good. He's back.
So just out of curiosity, you've been doing this a while. What is your favorite Johnny Cash song to play?
pick the day. It depends what my mood is. What I want to be listening to, or what I like to play.
Yeah.
Oh, gosh. Well, same thing. I guess pick the mood. I mean, I really like the song "Sunday Morning Coming Down." It's a great written tune by Chris Christopherson. The imagery is great. The lyrics are great. And the structure of the song is good. And Cash's delivery on the original, his song, was fantastic. I like playing it. I like singing it. But I like a song like, we do "I've Been Everywhere," which is, you got to get through, gosh, I don't even know how many cities are in it. There's got to be 40 cities that you got to get, maybe 50 in 2.5 minutes. So that's a fun one to do because it's always a challenge.
And when people come to your show, what do you hope that they walk away with? Is there like a special feeling or
I think
is there a special feeling that you want people to walk away with from the show?
There is. I want them to walk away with, really, if they're Johnny Cash fans, I want them to kind of be taken back to that time, especially if they saw him and listen to the music, to say, wow, it takes them back to a time where in their life when they were listening to that. And, we've had a lot of folks that, talked to a lot of people who saw Johnny Cash early on. I mean, in the 50s, 1955, 56. And they have a story to share. They're, I was in the service, or my girlfriend and I, who's now my wife of 50 or 60 years, we listened to that, and it just took us back to a great time. So I guess, that kind of, nostalgic feeling is good. And for young people that are discovering Cash, I hope they walk away understanding that, how important and impactful his music is and continues to be, I think, in the social consciousness of the fabric of our country, and the impact that he had in the music scene, because we do talk about that in the show, the impact that he had on other musicians. And there's certainly less than, everyone could be connected to Johnny Cash in the entertainment business, it seems, less than 6 degrees, way better than Kevin Bacon. So I think people are like, wow, I didn't know, he worked with Dylan and Pete Seeger and, Hank Williams Jr. and all the way to, Brooks and Dunn, if you will, when they were hot in the 90s. So we want people to walk away with an appreciation for Cash and a love and feeling that they were taken back to a time too in their life when they saw or heard Johnny Cash.
So for a young person that may know one or two of his hits, like Ring of Fire or I don't name a hit, and they're inspired to learn more about him, what one album would you recommend?
Wow, that's a great question. It depends, because it's hard. I would almost say, well, you should go buy a greatest hits album, buy Johnny Cash greatest hits or giant hits, so that you get the totality of his music from the fun and novelty, like A Boy Named Sue, to love, Ring of Fire, I Walk the Line, to the dark side of, kind of the underbelly, if you will, of society, and songs about, death and dying and such. So I guess I'd recommend that. It's hard because if you say, well, go listen to Folsom Prison Blues, which is an incredible album, there aren't too many hits off of Folsom Prison Blues or at Folsom Prison, aside from Folsom Prison Blues. But when he showed up there to do the record, he put together a show list, a set list that did not include his big hits. Ring of Fire was not on there. I Walk the Line's not on there. Those Sun record hits of the 50s are not there. He put together a song list that he thought would resonate with the inmates at prison. So there are songs, obviously, a lot about prison, and so if you were to go out and pick that out, you wouldn't hear some of the big hits, but you also do get you get the electricity of Johnny Cash, and like, oh, okay, well, I do get this guy. San Quentin would be another great album to get as well.
Awesome. And so when people come see the show, they're not, I mean, this isn't like your typical Beatles tribute where you just go out and play a set. You're actually sort of talking about his life and giving them more in depth than just the songs, right?
Indeed. It's a concert, certainly. You know, we play 25 or so songs or more, I guess 28, 30 songs. But in between all of those songs, there's a story. There's a story about that song, how it came to be, what was happening in Cash's life, who wrote it. So it's really a concert with a history lesson, if you will. I don't know how else to brand it. It's kind of like a documentary live. I mean, you know, just with some storytelling. It's not scripted. I mean, it's not, but every song has a story, and folks leave with those stories. And that's something we've done from day one. That's what I wanted to do, is really a tribute to Johnny Cash, not just play his songs. You know, there's a lot of people that, you know, do that, and I like doing that. But I want to educate people about Johnny Cash, and to know about, you know, these songs and know about his life and what was happening around his life at the time these songs were written and recorded. And I'm always glad to hear people say, you know, wow, we learned a lot about Johnny Cash. Not only do we, you know, like listening to the music, we learned a lot about him at the end of the show. And that's real special for people to know.
And what... so I'm guessing after you saw his concert when you were younger, there was no meet and greets back then. You never got a chance to actually meet him, or did you ever get a chance to meet him?
I did, and it was really? there wasn't a meet and greet, but I forced my way to to meet him. We saw him in Fresno Tower Theater. Sorry, I don't know if you can hear that. My computer keeps dinging, but. I saw him in Fresno at the Tower Theater. The show got over. We ran around the back of the theater because we had seen where he was parked. You know, I had a tour bus back there, and got up to that bus. He was getting on already. I just ran up there. I was so nervous. I just wanted to meet him, you know. And I was so nervous. My voice cracked. I just told him, I'm your biggest fan. And he said, well, glad to know you. And it was great. I mean, it was a very short meeting, obviously, but I remember driving home and looking at my hand like, I will never wash this hand again. For the record, I have. But, you know, I was 12, 13, I guess at the time, 14. And so I did meet him, and he was just, you know, he was very gracious. I mean, he's had to have met a million people in his life, I bet, if not more. And, you know, he took the time to shake hands with a nerdy little kid, you know, who loved his music.
If you could go back and actually have time with him, what would you want to know? What would you ask him? What is there like a burning question that you would like to ask him?
I don't know about a burning question, but I am fascinated by his upbringing and his childhood. I mean, he did have a real hard life. I mean, they grew up, you talk about being, you know, dirt poor. I mean, they were sharecropper farmers in Arkansas, part of the New Deal. They got 40 acres and a mule, and they had to make it work. You know, they didn't have anything. And I think so much of his formative years, you know, growing up there in Northeast Arkansas, you hear that in the music. It's there. He writes about that stuff. He draws on it. And of course, his life was, he had a brother that passed away at a young age in a tragic accident at a woodworking shop there at the school, and they were very close. And I guess I'd just like to learn more about, you know, I've read everything there is. I've talked to his daughter about his, you know, his life growing up. But to sit down with Johnny Cash and really hear about those years, those early years, and all the way through the Air Force, so much of that, you know, that is just like any of us, right? You know, we are the sum of our experiences, and sure. For Johnny Cash, I'd like to hear more about that.
And so you met his daughter. Has she seen the show?
Yeah, she has. In fact, she's been on our show before. We did, being that this is the 50-year anniversary of Cash at Folsom, we did an anniversary concert on the day of, the January 13th, 50 years later, in Folsom at the Harris Center, which is a performing arts center here in Folsom. And we invited Tara, and I've known Tara for several years. She's the youngest daughter from his first marriage. And she wrote a book, or published a book that she had given to her dad about his growing up. And he answered all these questions about life growing up, and she's published it. And anyway, I said, you know, we got this show coming up. I would just be honored if you'd like to come and be part of the show, and we could do a talk about your dad and your book and life growing up with, you know, Johnny Cash as your dad. And she said, yeah, let's do it. So we did. It was a wonderful event. I mean, it was just meant so much to me and the audience to have Johnny Cash's daughter there. And then as we were prepping for it, I mean, like a week before the show, she said, you know what, I like to sing a song too. And I'm like, sure. I mean, that was not on the original plan. But she had toured with her dad in the 70s and 80s, been on the show as a singer. So she sang with us. We sang a Johnny Cash song together, and it was just real special. So she's been part of the show, and she's just had some really nice comments about how we present the show and her dad's life and the music and the stories about her dad. It's been nice.
That's awesome. Well, we are out of time. I really do appreciate you taking the time to chat with us and letting us know more about the show. We're really looking forward to it. It's November 3rd, Friday night at 8 o'clock at the Armstrong Theater. Tickets are still available, but you better hurry because they're going to go fast after people hear this. James, it's an honor to, to talk to you, and I look forward to seeing you very soon.
Oh, our pleasure. Thanks for the time. We look forward to seeing everyone down there in Torrance.
Awesome. Thanks so much.